The Southern Railway Q1 class occupies a singular place in British locomotive history as one of the most distinctive, controversial and effective freight steam designs ever produced. Conceived in the darkest years of the Second World War and designed by Oliver Bulleid, the class was an austerity locomotive in the truest sense, stripped of ornament, engineered with ruthless economy, yet endowed with remarkable power and utility. 40 examples were built in 1942, and although they were intended to meet an urgent wartime need rather than to enjoy a long working life, they proved so useful that they survived in service until July 1966. In appearance, they were unlike any other British steam locomotive, their slab-sided casing, lack of running plate and stark box-like profile earning them a host of nicknames including Ugly Ducklings, Coffee Pots, Charlies, Biscuit Tins, Biscuit Barrels, Clockworks and Frankensteins. For all the mockery directed at their looks, however, the Q1 class became the ultimate development of the British mainline 060 freight engine and demonstrated what could be achieved when wartime necessity, bold engineering and operational realism were combined. The background to the Q1 lay in the Southern Railway's position on the eve of war. Until late 1939, the Southern had been primarily a high-density passenger and commuter railway serving London and the southeast of England, with a substantial proportion of its network electrified using third rail current collection. Freight had never been ignored, but it had not been the company's foremost concern in the same way it was on some of the other great railway companies. When war came, that situation altered dramatically. Owing to its geographical position facing continental Europe, the Southern became a vital strategic artery for the movement of troops, munitions, supplies and military equipment. It was suddenly on the British front line of the war effort and found itself under intense pressure to handle traffic far heavier than its existing freight locomotive fleet had been designed to accommodate. The newest freight engines available were the Q-class 060s of 1938, the last design associated with Richard Maunsell. Those locomotives had been conceived as replacements for older inherited 060s and, although modern by Southern standards, were fundamentally traditional machines, built to principles which observers regarded as essentially Victorian in origin. Maunsell had retired at the end of October 1937 and had been succeeded by Bulleid, who brought with him a far more adventurous and unconventional approach to design. Faced with wartime demands, the Southern required a locomotive with high tractive effort, light axle loading, and the widest possible route availability. The brief was therefore clear, a freight engine of great pulling power, but of sufficiently low weight to work over almost the whole system. Bulleid's answer was the Q1. It was his second locomotive design for the Southern Railway, and represented his response not merely to a traffic problem, but to a wider wartime shortage of labour and materials. He concentrated on function, utility and economy, seeking to use the smallest possible quantity of scarce raw materials while still producing a machine of exceptional capability. The result, emerging in 1942, was a locomotive which many contemporaries thought ugly beyond redemption, but which was in fact one of the cleverest examples of British wartime engineering. It was designed as an austerity locomotive, meaning that everything not essential to performance or maintenance was pared away. Running plates, splashes and decorative refinements disappeared, welding was employed extensively as a means of saving both weight and materials, and Bulleid also deliberately chose the 060 wheel arrangement, partly because of its adhesion, and partly because it offered a practical way of achieving a powerful goods engine without unacceptable axle loadings. Though old-fashioned in wheel arrangement, the Q1 was not old-fashioned in conception. On the contrary, it was a synthesis of traditional freight engine logic and modern engineering practice, and Bulleid himself is later to have regarded the class as one of his proudest achievements. The external appearance of the Q1 was a direct consequence of these priorities. Its stepped, angular and rather brutal casing was not merely a stylistic whim, though it also reflected Bulleid's liking for modern, somewhat continental-looking locomotive forms. A decisive influence was the use of a glass fibre insulating material known as Eiderglass for boiler lagging, with this material being cheap and plentiful during the war, but it could not support weight in the manner of conventional cladding, and so a separate outer casing had to be provided. This casing, following the general practice seen in Bulleid's Merchant Navy class, produced the Q1's characteristic boxy silhouette. The boiler rings were adapted to support the lagging and casing arrangement, and the omission of a conventional running plate further accentuated the starkness of the design. Yet this same smooth-sided form had practical advantages, as like Bulleid's Merchant Navy class, and later the West Country and Battle of Britain Pacifics, the Q1 could be passed through a coach washer for cleaning, a very real benefit at a time when manpower was scarce and lengthy hand cleaning could not be justified. The enclosed cab also offered crews some protection from the elements and, according to some accounts, reduced the locomotive's visual prominence from above, a matter not entirely irrelevant in wartime conditions. Despite its radical appearance, the Q1's design was by no means wholly exotic in mechanical terms. It shared certain elements with the earlier Q class, including valve gear components and the steam reverser, and beneath the casing it remained a practical, workmanlike freight engine. Nevertheless, its specifications were highly impressive for a British 060. The locomotive was fitted with two inside cylinders measuring 19 inches by 26 inches, working through Stephenson link motion with outside admission piston valves. The piston valves had a full gear travel of 6 1/8 inches and a steam lap of 1 5/8 inches, and they were set at a notably steep inclination, another unusual feature of the class. The boiler pressure was 230 pounds per square inch, and the class developed a tractive effort of 30,080 pounds, with this output making the Q1 the most powerful 060 tender locomotive to run on Britain's railways. The blast arrangement consisted of a 5-nozzle blast pipe, coupled with a short, wide chimney, giving the smoke box front its distinctive tunnel mouth appearance and contributing to the class's strong steaming reputation. The boiler itself was among the most important features of the design. It was based upon that of the Lord Nelson class and used the same throat plate and backplate dimensions, while being adapted for the new locomotive's requirements. The barrel was 10 foot 6 inches long, with a diameter of 5 foot 0 inches at the front and 5 foot 9 inches at the back. The firebox was of copper rather than steel, in contrast to Bulleid's Pacific designs, and this choice reflected both practical and performance considerations. The grate area was 27 square feet, exceptionally large for a British 060, and in fact the largest associated with any class of that wheel arrangement in Britain. The boiler contained 209 tubes and 21 flues, with a tube and flue heating surface of 1,302 square feet and a firebox heating surface of 170 square feet, giving a total evaporative heating surface of 1,472 square feet. In addition, the superheater contributed 218 square feet of heating surface, with all of this meaning that the Q1 possessed an excellent steam-raising capacity, entirely appropriate to the heavy wartime freight turns for which it had been intended. The driving wheels were 5 foot 1 inch in diameter and were Bulleid Firth Brown patent disc wheels, adaptations of the type already in use on Bulleid's Pacific locomotives. These wheels provided all-round tyre support, were lighter than conventional spoked wheels, and formed another part of Bulleid's systematic weight-saving program. According to the Science Museum Group's description of preserved C1, the locomotive itself weighed 51.25 tons and measured 54 foot 10.5 inches in length, while the broader class was celebrated for being approximately 14 tons lighter than a comparable locomotive of a more orthodox design. That lightness was central to the Q1's operational value. The class was designed to combine very high power with very wide route availability, and in this it succeeded brilliantly, with contemporary descriptions noting that the engine weighed less than 90 tons overall and could work over more than 97% of the Southern Railway's route mileage. This was crucial on a railway which suddenly had to handle huge wartime freight flows over infrastructure not always suited to heavy locomotive types, and the Q1 was thus capable of hauling trains that on other lines would have often required significantly larger engines, and in effect, Bulleid had created a compact, relatively light 060 which could perform duties out of proportion to its size and wheel arrangement. All 40 locomotives were built during 1942, with the first 20 constructed at Brighton Works, and the remaining 20 at Ashford Works. Bulleid applied his preferred continental-style numbering system, derived in part from UIC practice and shaped by his earlier experience at Westinghouse in France. In this scheme, the letter C denoted 3 coupled driving axles, so the class emerged as C1 to C40. The livery adopted under the Southern Railway was as austere as the locomotives themselves, plain freight black, with cab side numbers in sunshine yellow and Southern on the tender shaded in green. Even in this there was an element of Bulleid's modern outlook, but the overall effect was one of severe wartime utility. Once in service, the class immediately justified its existence. The Q1s thrived on the heavy freight duties for which they had been designed, and rapidly became an indispensable part of the Southern Railway's wartime locomotive fleet. Powerful, free-steaming, and able to travel over routes barred to heavier engines, they formed the backbone of the Southern's heavy goods capability during the war years. They hauled the military and supply traffic upon which the railway's strategic value depended, and they did so in such a way that their initial conception as temporary austere expedients soon proved unduly modest. They were not confined entirely to freight work, with their generous route availability meaning that they could, and often did, deputise on secondary passenger services when required, where they showed themselves capable of respectable speed and sound performance. At the same time, the design was not without defects. The tender braking system, built in keeping with wartime weight-saving priorities, was comparatively light, and the class gained a reputation for poor braking on unfitted goods trains. This limitation was serious enough to count against any large post-war extension of the design, but even so, the balance of judgment remained strongly in the class's favour, for in the circumstances in which they were introduced, they delivered exactly the combination of power, economy, and flexibility that the Southern most urgently required. The Q1 also carried a symbolic significance in locomotive development. It represented the final flowering of the British mainline 060 tender freight locomotive, with subsequent medium-powered freight designs such as the LMS Ivat Class 2 and Class 4 moguls moving to a 260 arrangement, and the 060 was not revived in the British Railways standard range. In British Railways service, the class was assigned power classification 5F, a notable distinction because very few 060s ever exceeded 4F. While other exceptions existed, such as the LNER J20 at 5F, the J39 at 4P5F, and the J38 at 6F, the Q1 nevertheless stood in rare company. It was therefore both a culmination and an anomaly, a final exceptionally capable example of an old wheel arrangement, yet embodied in a locomotive whose appearance and construction methods seemed to belong to a more experimental future. Nationalisation in 1948 brought administrative changes, but no immediate end to the class's usefulness. The locomotives retained their plain black finish, though the tenders now carried British Railways in sunshine yellow, before later receiving the standard British Railways crest. From 1950 onward, they appeared in unlined British Railways freight black, still with no decorative embellishment. Under the BR numbering scheme, the class became 33001 to 33040, with C1 being renumbered to 33001, while depot allocations after the war varied, but the class was concentrated mainly at Guildford, Feltham, Eastleigh and Tunbridge, with later prominence at Three Bridges and smaller numbers at depots such as Nine Elms, Hither Green, St Leonard's and Stewart's Lane. What is especially striking about the Q1 class is the length of its subsequent career. As being a design introduced under extreme wartime pressure, and never envisaged as a permanent long-term solution, it remained intact as a complete class until the 1960s. Throughout the years from 1943 to 1962, the whole complement of 40 locomotives remained in service. Their longevity testified not only the shortage of more modern replacement motive power, but also to the simple fact that they worked well and filled a role that did not disappear with peace. They continued to haul heavy goods trains, mainly over comparatively short distances, with some of these traceable to the economies of wartime construction, including the tendency of thin steel plates to become porous with age. Anecdotal evidence even suggested that in their final years, crews were sometimes told to close the regulator when entering stations, to avoid ash being blown through the sides of the smokebox and onto passengers. Yet these shortcomings did not negate the larger reality that the Q1s had outlasted all expectations. Withdrawals began only in 1963, when the first 13 members of the class were taken out of service, while in 1964, a further 20 were withdrawn, leaving just 7 in service. In 1965, another 4, 33004, 009, 018 and 026, were withdrawn, and in 1966, the final 3, 006, 020 and 027, disappeared, bringing the class's working career to an end in July of that year. Fortunately, one member of the class escaped the cutter's torch. The first built locomotive, C1, later 33001, was preserved for the National Collection, and now resides at the National Railway Museum in York, where it carries its original Southern Railway livery and number. Before returning to York in 2004, it spent many years associated with the Bluebell Railway in Sussex, running there from September 14, 1980 until the spring of 1983, and there again from September 9, 1992 until the summer of 2000. In retrospect, the Southern Railway Q1 class can be seen as one of the great paradoxes of British steam engineering. It was an austerity design, yet it was highly innovative. It used an apparently outdated 060 wheel arrangement, yet it marked the ultimate development of that type on British main lines. It was lampooned for its looks, yet admired for its performance. It was intended as a wartime expedient, yet endured for almost a quarter of a century. Above all, it demonstrated Oliver Bulleid's ability to think beyond convention and to produce a locomotive exactly suited to the extraordinary demands placed upon the Southern Railway during the Second World War. The Q1 class was not beautiful in any traditional sense, but it was brilliantly purposeful, mechanically significant, and historically important. Its surviving representative, C1, therefore stands as a reminder that some of the most successful engineering achievements are those born not from elegance, but from urgent necessity met with imagination and skill.